Well, it's not often you get a programme on General Franco with exclusive sound of a stalk in a tree. It sounds like a machine gun. In fact, it wasn't a machine gun, it was a stalk, but it would have been a machine gun about 70 years ago, because this is where the Spanish nationalist troops engaged in their last ferocious attempt to invade Madrid. This is the Casa del Campo, the old royal hunting ground next to the royal palace in Madrid, and stretches away green and peaceful, rather like Regent's Park in London. It's got a zoo as well, and that's where we are now. For a whole week, the battle raged, and the losses on both sides was astronomical. And you can see now why it took such a long time. It's an immensely wooded area. They had to fight from tree to tree.
The advance of General Franco's columns is pushed on remorselessly. White troops and Moors, well armed and trained in modern methods of warfare.
Porque Madrid estaba absolutamente sitiado. No teníamos más que una salida.
We all had to fight because Madrid was under siege. From the beginning, the Casa de Campo was fought over.
Estaban los franquistas.
Half of it was held by the Franquistas, half of it by us. We knew everything. We knew how young this general was. He'd been in Africa. He was known as the Africanist.
En el otro lado, una represión terrible, lo sabían todas.
We all knew about the repression going on behind the lines, in the areas that had fallen to Franco. And so we knew how terrible it would be if Franco took Madrid. We had to fight.
In a way, the Spanish Civil War lasted for 3 years because that's how long it took to capture Madrid. And when Madrid finally fell in 1939, Franco embarked on nearly 4 decades of dictatorship. The Generalísimo Francisco Franco Bahamonde would reign longer than Hitler or Mussolini, longer even than Tito or Salazar. Not bad for a rather weedy boy from a remote town in a remote region with neither wealth nor connections to help him on his way.
The naval harbour of El Ferrol has been renamed El Ferrol del Caudillo. And the house where he was born in 1892 still stands.
Dad was a naval supplies officer in Ferrol, a remote naval base in Galicia in the rainy northwest top corner of Spain, a sort of Spanish Barrow in Furnace. And it was here that Francisco Paulino Hermenegildo Teodoro Franco Bahamonde was born. Paul Preston, who is now Professor of Contemporary Spanish History at the London School of Economics, sent me off to the place where modern Spanish history really began.
¿Estabas buscando la casa donde nació General Franco?
Sí, yo lo sentí.
The father was a bit of a wastrel. He was a big drinker, liked attractive women, apparently liked to gamble. Absolutely typical for a well-heeled middle-class Spaniard of his generation. I suspect that the home life was full of gloom and guilt. The father was out on the razzle, and the mother was at home feeling miserable and managing to project this misery on everyone around her.
Sí, vivió en Ferrol porque fue una figura, un hijo de aquí.
I believe that Franco got it in his mind that the breakup of his family, and basically his father left home round about the turn of the century and went off with another woman, that he associated in his mind what he saw as the crimes of his father, the decadence of his father, with, of course, the great disaster in Spanish history, which was the loss of empire.
In 1898, the Spanish Empire finally crumbled, and all the sailors came back from Cuba, the last bastion of the Spanish Empire, and they must have come back to here too, because you hear stories about them being poured off the boats or wounded, missing arms and legs. And a young Franco must have thought, Spain is finished. Of course, they never think Spain is finished. What they think is, one day, Spain will be great again.
Spain had met a disaster because it was in the hands of people like his father, the embodiment of everything that he hated in the left and liberalism and democracy and decadence and all that kind of thing. He saw in Franco all of the things that oppressed him in life. He saw him as someone who was deeply pious, effeminate, clung to his mother.
Now, apart from the boring slab of marble up there, which tells you when Franco was born and when he died, but nothing in between, there's also a wonderful bas-relief a bit further along. It's a big globe of the world, and Franco leaning on the globe of the world, he's dressed like a young soldier. Actually, he's dressed more like the young Errol Flynn. You can imagine him dashing out of the bush, binoculars slung around his neck in a rather sort of glamorous pose. And he's got a huge dagger in his right hand. I don't think he ever used a dagger. He preferred things rather more dramatic than that.
If you had to say afterwards, what was Franco's political thought? It's basically that Spain is like a big family, and all those on the left are like his father, and they're philanderers and wastrels and so on. And what this big family needs is exactly what his family needed and didn't have. That was a very strong but benevolent father figure. And that's what he thought he was. And of course, he never allowed there to be democracy, because his line was, Spaniards are like anarchic children and don't be given democracy. So I think that actually his childhood tells us a lot about what he thought he was doing later on. And of course, he thought about it in terms of great benevolence, and rather forgot about the bloodshed that made it possible.
Francisco Franco was only 5'4" high. His voice was always rather high-pitched. Small wonder that he was sometimes made fun of and nicknamed Franquito, Little Franco. But when he got sent to military academy in Toledo, a far cry from the rainy seaside of his native Galicia, he buckled down, gritted his teeth, and took soldiering very seriously indeed. Seriously enough that when he took his first posting away from home, it was in the one place where he could taste battle at first hand, Morocco. He landed in the middle of a bloody colonial war. The Spanish were determined to keep their last remaining foreign possession. The tribal hillsmen were equally determined to kick them out. Franco arrived as a wet-behind-the-ears 19-year-old. He quickly made a name for himself as a methodical and ruthless soldier. And by the time he left Morocco 10 years later, he was poised for big promotion, big fame. María Rosa de Madariaga is a historian of Spanish Morocco.
I call them Africano-militaristas. I have invented the word. Because Africanist is the one who is interested in Africa, in learning things about Africa, the customs of people, history of these people, and the only thing that we're interested for them is to have promotions, you know.
Was Franco like that?
Yeah, Franco was exactly like that, yes. In the year 26 of the last century, he was general. He was promoted to general.
Very young.
Very young. He was, I think, something like 33 years old.
The Spanish army that Franco found himself in Morocco had many proud traditions, but not a great deal else. Equipment, organisation and morale were all patchy, and they didn't always carry the day against the Moroccan rebels. Franco found that ruthlessness made up for a great deal, combined with solid planning, so when the Spanish Foreign Legion was formed, he had no objection to being transferred there as second in command. The legionnaires were as tough and violent as you'd expect from a bunch of outlaws and misfits. Franco was just as tough. Paul Preston, who must know Franco better than any other Englishman alive, having spent over 10 years writing his life story.
He was certainly very brave, for what it's worth, and because, unlike most of his fellows, he didn't drink, he had no interest in women, he didn't play cards, whereas they would do whatever they could do or find to take their minds off the sheer awfulness of fighting in the hills against these tribesmen who were much better at fighting in the hills than the Spaniards were. He would do things like make maps and do logistical studies and so on. So, you know, he was actually quite good at what he did. So he did a combination of two things, competence and making sure that his merits were known about by all those who could help him.
Thanks to his exploits in Morocco, Franco had become a household name in Spain, where military heroes were in short supply. Whenever army people were planning a military coup, which they did with cheerful regularity in the 20s and 30s, they always tried to get Franco to join in. Franco, with all his Galician reluctance to commit himself, never thought the time was ripe. He became one of the youngest generals in Europe. He got married, had a daughter, watched the dictator Miguel Primo de la Rivera take over power from the king, saw them both replaced by the Republic in 1931, and went on quietly being a man with a big future, giving nothing away. I don't think I would ever have liked to play poker against Franco. But even he must have betrayed some pleasure when he was sent to quell a huge strike in Asturias in 1934. Asturias was full of miners. It was very left-wing. The government gave him carte blanche to put them down.
he learned a lot from the crisis of October 1934 in Asturias, because he was for 15 days a military dictator in legal terms.
The historian Enrique Moradiellos, who was born in Asturias and has written both a history of the Asturian miners and a biography of Franco.
The Republican government proclaimed the state of emergency, resigned powers in the military leadership. The military leadership chose General Franco as commander of the operations, and General Franco designed and applied the whole of the complex, military complex, to suppress the rebellion in Asturias.
Now, when he says the whole of the military complex, he means something quite unprecedented. He means that Franco brought in his Moroccan mercenaries. Regular soldiers might not be relied upon to fire on Spanish workers, but Moroccan troops who'd been well trained by their Spanish masters in the art of ruthless reprisal did not hesitate to shoot miners or their families. Nor did Franco hesitate to bomb and shell working-class homes. The strike collapsed in 15 days. It was excellent practice for the Civil War. Enrique Moradiellos again.
After October 1934, he was clearly the most important military commander, recognized as such for all the army, even when he was not the older and in the hierarchy was not at the top, and in the conservative public he gained his medals. He was the man on horseback with a spear, able to suppress subversion, socialist, communist or anarchist.
But memories of him in Asturias must be rather different. He must...
Well, in general terms, of course, because the dictatorship was very brutal in Asturias. But it is true that there are other sections of the population, those of Catholic persuasion or right-wing ideology, who still consider him the man who saved us from anarchy and communism.
So we're in the great cathedral of Santiago de Compostela, which is, of course, St. James of Compostela. St. James was one of the 12 disciples, but not one of the big boys. He didn't write a gospel, he didn't do much in the Bible. His reputation in Spain, oddly enough, is as a great slayer of the Moors. This is not something he did in real life. Unlike Franco, who made his reputation as a crusher of Moroccan rebellions, Franco then went one better than St. James by using his Moroccan troops as great slayers of Spanish republicans in the Civil War. Franco had grown up in a good Catholic area near the Premier League pilgrim destination of Santiago de Compostela, and he always sought the support of the Catholic Church whenever possible. And of course he was surrounded by Catholic women, his pious mother, his pious wife, and, extraordinarily, the left arm of Santa Teresa, a relic captured in the Civil War from a convent and taken everywhere by Franco on his travels. The nuns often wrote to him to ask for it back, which gives a new meaning to begging for alms. He always sent them a contribution back, but never the arm. So, was he a good Catholic? The Spanish theologian Enrique Miret Magdalena thinks not.
Yo sinceramente creo que no.
Well, I don't think so. There are records that still exist of his time in religion, and there was a quote from Franco to his troops in Morocco, and he said,
Aquí, ni misa, ni mujeres, sino simplemente obedecer.
Here, there will be no mass and no women, only obedience. This idea of waging a religious crusade against the unfaithful, that was an idea that was suggested to him by some Spanish bishops, an idea of the war as a war of religion. He took that idea to justify his regime and the military uprising against the Republic.
Franco may have been a Catholic, but his Moroccan troops certainly weren't. Not that that really bothered him, as Maria Rosa de Madariaga discovered when she unearthed evidence of Franco's brief career as a travel agent.
So he organized the travel. They put some ships at the disposition of these Moroccans that wanted to do the pilgrimage to Mecca, and all kind of facilities for the trip to Mecca.
When was this?
It was during the Civil War.
He actually organised a trip to Mecca during the Civil War?
Yes. I mean, yes, because he wanted to have all these Moroccans on his part, and so he decided that the best way to do it is to say, I'm not against Islam, I like Islam, it's a religion. We are Christians, you are Muslims, but anyway, both of us, we are against atheism.
I didn't know that.
The first time it was in 37, then in 38, and then in 39. And so they were, of course, making a sort of exaltation of Franco as the protector of Islam and protector of Moroccan people, etc.
By 1936, General Franco was the army chief on the Canary Islands. In mainland Spain, things were falling to pieces in the usual pre-war way. Strikes, reprisals, unemployment, government indecision. On the Canary Islands, things were a lot more fun. Franco was starting English lessons and had just discovered the joys of golf. Indeed, he'd planned to go to Scotland that summer for a golfing holiday. But when his fellow generals came to him yet again and urged his cooperation in a military coup, he finally felt it was time to act. They needed his reputation and, crucially, his ability to rally the priceless Army of Africa. Franco believed that he could save Spain, and Morocco was the key to his eventual victory. Now, you may never have heard of Franco's fellow rebel generals, Mola, Sanjurjo, all the others, and that's probably because they didn't have the elite troops of the Spanish army at their disposal. The Spanish and Moroccan soldiers battle-hardened by years of colonial warfare. With a little help from Hitler, who Franco persuaded to lay on all the air transport, they were able to storm through southern Spain, handing Franco one victory after another. So he never did get that golfing holiday in Scotland, but you can't win them all. For many of those who fought with him, or more precisely, slightly in front of him, the consequences were more serious. As for one Moroccan soldier whose letter home Maria Rosa de Madariaga recently discovered.
And I tell you that none of you should make the mistake of enlisting, because no one who comes here should think he'll get back alive. In a single day, 350 of us have been killed. And don't believe those who say that this is a good place. It's a terrible war, and all those who have come have regretted it immediately. We are about to march into battle and have been under fire night and day for 15 days. There is a lot of shooting and artillery fire, and I could tell you many, many other things, but it would take too long.
Most of the Moroccan soldiers were fighting for money rather than commitment to a cause, but for the Spanish it was a battle for the nation's destiny. Some fought to defend the Catholic Church and to save Spain from communism, anarchy and disintegration. Lala Isla's father was one of the first volunteers.
My father was a student of chemistry in Valladolid. He went to the war because he thought that Spain was in chaos. They were burning churches, there was disorder, and the workers were not doing what the workers are supposed to do.
Florentino Portero is Professor of Contemporary History at UNED, Spain's equivalent of the Open University.
In the 30s, the menace, the threat of a communist dictatorship in some countries in Europe was a reality, as a threat, as a possibility. And fascism was, for many conservatives, just an instrument to block the possibility of a communist alternative.
The film director José Luis Borau remembers the years before the war.
Spanish history in 30s, just before the Spanish Civil War, was awful. I remember that. People were killing people just before the war. People were running, they were burning churches, and no one, no leftist, no rightist, they were respecting the other people. I mean, sometimes the history goes through, like in Greek tragedy, you know, you see that everything is going to happen and it happens. The Civil War began by itself, by the country itself.
Those on the Republican side fought to defend a democratically elected government, to defeat fascism, for a more progressive Spain. Faced with a conquering army, many simply fought for their lives. And whichever side you were on, you soon realised it was not going to be over by Christmas. Paul Preston.
The Spanish Civil War, when it starts off, the idea of the military conspirators is that they will have an uprising in each of the provincial capitals of each of Spain's 50 provinces, and that the whole thing will be over in a day or two. That was their first notion. Now what happens is, they're right in areas that are right-wing, and they're wrong in areas that are left-wing. Catholic, agrarian areas, the coup is successful, and working-class industrial areas, it isn't, and also areas of big estates and landless labourers, it isn't. Now, of course, there are lots of exceptions. In the south, for instance, the capitals, the provincial capitals, Seville, Córdoba, Granada, so on, they tend to fall to the nationalists, but the hinterland, which of course is soon conquered, to the left. But the big industrial towns, Barcelona, Bilbao, Valencia, these go to the left.
As it turned into a long drawn-out war, the anti-fascist cause attracted many idealistic combatants from abroad who formed the international brigades. Tens of thousands came here to fight as volunteers or to work in the medical services. Thousands of Germans and Italians fought for Franco too, but they were sent by Hitler and Mussolini, so you wouldn't really call them volunteers. Much more typical of the idealistic foreign arrival was the 19-year-old Steve Fullerton, who was just a lad in Glasgow till he was inspired to join the Republican side.
The most influential thing was that I was collecting food for Spain and collecting money for Spain, and just accepted it. It was just something that you got into. And the newsreels in the cinema, twice a week the newsreels were changed, government British. They would show the bombing, particularly in Madrid, and just showing the terror on these people's faces, the dreadful things.
We're standing in a field in southern Catalonia. During the Civil War, Steve trained and fought in the hills around us, and further south, on the other side of the River Ebro.
What I could do, I had no idea, but I just felt strongly that what was happening was dreadful, and that I was prepared to go and try and do something about it.
Yo recuerdo todo. Yo personalmente.
I never went underground. The first place where you could take refuge was the underground, the metro, and then some new shelters were built. But I was too exhausted at night. I was working the whole day, so I never went down underground. I never went to a shelter. I was with my husband, and we were just too tired. We went to sleep, hearing the bombs and listening to the planes, and hoping they would pass by.
Estábamos abrazados y decían que pasen las bombas y que pasen los obuses y que pasen todo.
Paul Preston.
He used the tactics and the strategy of colonial war, which was about terrorizing civilian population. So the first part of the Civil War, when of course it wasn't a civil war, I mean, if you invade with a colonial army an area inhabited entirely by civilians, it's hardly a civil war, but anyway, that's a whole other story. The Moroccan mercenaries, who were used normally by the Spaniards to terrorize and suppress the Moroccan population, were brought into southern Spain to terrorize and suppress the working class, particularly the agrarian working class of the south. Later in the war, when he had much more advanced technology, I mean, remember that the Germans came in with the Condor Legion, which effectively, was relatively small in size, but was utterly sort of cutting-edge advanced technology. They were in despair most of the time because Franco didn't understand how to use it, partly to do with the fact that he wasn't comfortable with that kind of warfare, but it's also because he wanted a different kind of war. I mean, Franco didn't just want to beat the Republic quickly. In fact, he didn't want to beat the Republic quickly at all. What he wanted was to have a very long, slow campaign, because he wanted to reap terror far and wide, so in order that his regime would last as long as ever. You've got to remember that for Franco, when Hitler spoke of, 1,000-year Reich, this is real short-termism in Franco's mind. Franco wanted a regime that would last forever.
There was no question that the two sides were evenly balanced. We were down to machine guns, more or less. On the retreat from Belchite to the Ebro, we lost the anti-tank guns. They were never replaced because by that time nothing was getting in to the Republican side that was of any use. So we more or less just had machine guns, a few artillery pieces, but they were few and far between and nowhere near what we ought to have had to oppose what we were up against. I never ever expected that we would lose in the manner in which we did. Or I say we, but I identify myself with the whole thing. Certainly it was never sort of upbeat. It was always the danger that they might get to Barcelona, or, you know, such things might happen. But personally, I never dreamt that it was as serious as it obviously was, yes.
The last centre of resistance was Catalonia, and when Barcelona fell, tens of thousands of refugees fled across the Pyrenees.
The French government is expecting something like 270,000 refugees and soldiers, of which they now have about 175,000 already over here. I can only tell you that this great flow of people goes on and on and on.
When a war ends, it's meant to be followed by peace, but Franco didn't see it that way. Having won the actual fighting, he now continued the persecution of those who had lost. The suffering of someone like Juana Doña, who we heard talking earlier about the siege of Madrid, was typical. It went on and on. Her husband was shot in 1941. She was separated from her son and then put in prison for 18 years. Whatever Franco wanted after the war was over, it was not truth and reconciliation. It was revenge, repression, and terror. Sadly for Spain, he turned out to be very good at all three.
The voice of Franco himself ending part one of the Generalísimo. The presenter was Miles Kington, and it was produced by Julia Adamson. Next week, Miles